Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Rob Amari is away, but Geoff Shullenberger and I will discuss hurricanes, Kamala Harris's comments on Iran, and attempts to limit so-called deepfakes. So first, Hurricane Helene. Been a lot of controversy. I guess the basic question is, is this the Biden-Harris Katrina? It seems that there's been an effort to paint it that way. Kanye West and a previous political incarnation said that Katrina showed that George W. Bush doesn't care about black people. Geoff, you and I are old enough. I think we remember this. I'm not sure how many how many of our listeners remember the ancient, long ago days of the second Bush term. So, what have you just made about the political controversy surrounding all this?
I've mostly just found it kind of depressing and highly cynical. I think that the larger thing to observe, I would say, is that the writer Michael Sacasas a few years ago introduced this concept of narrative collapse, which basically means that when you have a fragmented media landscape, not only do you have polarization around opinion, but you also have just the fragmentation of narrative into completely different spheres. So, depending which area of the media you dip into, you get a completely different story, right? And there isn't, in fact, just a shared narrative of even what the basic events are. And so that's been very evident with this. I mean, something that's been striking is the attempts to, I don't personally have an ability to assess how this particular emergency response compares to previous ones. I think very few people have that. So, and I've seen very few people attempting to, produce a sort of judicious analysis of how the deployment of resources in response to this disaster compares to previous ones, whether it is an outlier or whether it's simply the case that when you have a massive disaster, sometimes it takes time to deploy resources, and the results are not great for the people, but it's not necessarily something that can be immediately addressed. I mean, so obviously there's always going to be in this kind of instance an attempt to this is where like the sort of the figure of the president as sovereign kind of comes into play, where like when there's some disaster, there's some sense in which the responsibility does ultimately go up to the presidential level, because the president is in some sense, by virtue of his status, at least symbolically responsible for these situations. And so to that extent, I think, it's a disturbing moment to have a president who is absent, right? Or who's weirdly withdrawn from public life in the way that Joe Biden is. So, I mean, on that kind of symbolic level, I think this is a revealing moment. I'm not sure on the practical level. I just simply don't have the relevant information. And I think most of the people who claim that they do are, pushing some kind of partisan messaging. But the thing that strikes me is that, it's in terms of narrative collapse, is like everybody is finding ways to fit it into their narratives. So, for much of the right, it's become the story of how, well, FEMA has been, has been deployed to deal with the immigration crisis and therefore can't deal with this, right? Interestingly, for the left, what you've seen is, well, we're pouring all our resources into Israel, so we can't, like, the reason we're abandoning Western North Carolina is because all the money has gone to Israel. So this is a very kind of, both of these are a very crude sort of conceptualization of how government funding of various programs works. It's not as if there's just like a pot of money that you can only take so much out of, and then I mean, there is some sense of that, which is, the budget, but it's not as if there's literally just a limited pot of money that you can only take so much out of, and if you put it over in the Middle East, or if you put it over in the border region, then you can't put it in Western North Carolina. So, it seems that basically you've just had the emergence of all of these different narratives that, largely where the desire to pursue some pre-existing partisan agenda is the main impetus. And the result is just is that it's very difficult to find trustworthy accounts of what actually seems to be going on. But overall, I think what you seem to see is that local officials and local Republican officials, including local Republican officials, have attempted to, counter the kind of standard right wing kind of talking points, which weirdly often seem to be generated from these sort of, I always think of this figure of Ian Miles Chong, who's like a favorite of, one of Elon Musk's, most interacted with accounts, who's like this basically right wing troll in Malaysia. And of course, when you saw what was creating the narrative around what was happening in North Carolina, it's like Ian Miles Chong, this guy in Malaysia, is somehow driving this narrative. So that's kind of an illustration of how this thing is working. So I think, and just going back to your initial question, like on one level, again, I'd say symbolically, when you have a disaster like this and you have a president who seems to be absent, withdrawn, occupying this weird limbo status, there is something quite disturbing about that. And, regardless of how it plays out practically, it is at least symbolically indicative that something is quite amiss when you don't have a strong presidential figure who, as sort of theatrical as these kind of things are, nevertheless, they are meaningful. And I think that they do comprise a significant part of the president's sort of symbolic and cultural role in society. And so the extent to which that's been absent or confused or muddled is quite disturbing and revealing. As far as the actual practical on the ground thing, there are various narratives that can be spun out about, the administration not responding quickly enough, not allocating enough resources. Certainly some of these may be true. Some of them are definitely not. It's, I think, kind of hard to tell. But, beyond that, there are also kind of narratives that can be developed about, the congressional GOP essentially withholding funding for FEMA, for emergency response. And so I think it ends up being quite a muddled picture in terms of, where the political responsibility lies, if anywhere. But on the level of sort of symbolic responsibility, I think this is a revealing moment. How disastrous it will prove, I think, when we go back to Katrina. This is 2005. So this is pre-iPhone, I believe, and pre-social media for the most part, other than a little bit of Friendster and so on. So this was a moment, Katrina, when you had a single national narrative that was constructed and that everybody, to some extent, was part of and was following. And what we have today is a completely fragmented space of media narrative that means that nobody really even agrees on the basic facts of what's been occurring. And so I don't think it can quite have the impact, despite this level of kind of symbolic abdication and weakness on the part of the White House, which is real and meaningful. I don't know how impactful that will be compared to what it was in 2005, because the media landscape is so different and we don't all exist in the same narrative. Instead, we're just, either kind of inside a particular narrative bubble, or if you're someone like me, you're sort of dipping in and out of all these different narrative streams and trying to piece together some convincing narrative, from that. But I'm not sure that it can. And again, I think this is revealing of where we stand in media terms. Like, I'm not sure it can't have the same, or I wouldn't even say I'm not sure. I'd say it simply cannot have the same impact, because the Katrina moment was still one in which there was essentially a shared national news narrative of what in fact was happening, and that simply does not exist anymore.
The events seem to create, not create, but really point up problems for the political visions of both the Republicans and the Democrats. A basic problem for each side. For the Republicans, it's been striking to see people pointing to the response to Hurricane Helene as a sign that FEMA should be abolished. So the argument is, look, FEMA is ineffective. Not only is it ineffective, it is stopping other Americans from helping. Uh, it's worse than useless. We should get rid of it. So they kind of want something that's more effective, and because it isn't effective, they want to get rid of it altogether. Uh, it's not even really clear to me how seriously this is meant to be taken, even though GOP senators are engaging in it, because we certainly live in a country where the executive, the uh, president, is expected to lead a vigorous and active response to a national emergency. That's just the way Americans regard their country. And if you had a GOP president who, having absorbed years of more anarcho-capitalist thinking, just said, "Well, look, we'll leave it to the locals. The local boat brigade will do its work." Which is something that would certainly happen. Locals would help. People just wouldn't find that acceptable. So it's been striking to see that on the right. Then on the left, the I think the criticisms the right has offered of the response are getting at a sensitive point in current progressive governance. We really don't know the facts. We don't have any idea of whether the uh, FEMA's involvement in the facilitation and addressing of mass migration has limited its ability to respond to this. I think it's possible to get at that. If we can learn more about the budgeting, hopefully some reporting gives us information. But there is this dynamic at play in contemporary progressivism where the Democratic Party celebrates public services and defends their importance and presents itself as the party of government. Um, well, if you're, there are actually two ways to be the party of government. One is to, or at least two ways. One is to be the kind of party that is for government as kind of sinecure program, or the party of government as really effective public services that are directed at meeting these concrete needs of the public. And progressivism kind of goes back and forth on this, or at least seems to me. Uh, it's been very striking in New York City to see public schools turned over to be temporary migrant shelters, things like this. It suggests this process whereby kind of public infrastructure or things that were intended for American citizens are kind of being directed elsewhere. Um, and then you just view that alongside massive failure of things like our educational system in terms of actually promoting literacy. And you can say with justice that the Democratic Party is the party of government, but it's not always clear that it is the party of effective public services. So I think the GOP is trying to amplify and play on that concern, which I don't think can be dismissed as simply baseless. In terms of what's actually happening on the ground, my one friend who's been affected by this and displaced, I was texting with him asking what he made of these claims, and he just said to me, "Sorry, what are the claims? I don't even know," because he's been so busy just trying to get his family out of harm's way and get the stuff he needs for them. Um, so my own attempts at getting some kind of firsthand account of this have totally failed because uh, at least in this one case, the person involved in the actual events was so involved in them that he had no understanding of what the competing narratives were.
Yeah, this reminds me of a scene I often think of in Stendhal's The Charterhouse of Parma, which is that the young protagonist goes to, essentially to fight in the Battle of Waterloo, but to fight on the Napoleonic side. But when he gets there, he can't find the battle. It's like so he's kind of stumbling around trying to figure out like where all this grand heroic action is happening, and there's just a lot of chaos and messy crap everywhere, and when he asks people like, okay, where's the battle, like how do I, and they're just kind of like, what are you talking about? so I think this is often replicated in an interesting way in our, I mean, it's a great moment in terms of narrative because it's about it happens near the beginning of the novel, and it's essentially about the attempt to fuse some kind of overarching like historical narrative, ideological narrative to events on the ground, and it's about kind of the failure of that. And I often think there's yeah that there's a sort of similar scene in which I don't know if it in Lauren Euler's novel where she describes a woman going to the Women's March, and I don't know if she was directly inspired um, by Stendhal, but it kind of captures that as well. So yeah, I often think of that with these kinds of events, or just like when people talk about civil war or things like that. It's like um, you know I imagine somebody who's just very online, like going out in the world and trying to find the Civil War and not being able to find it.
Yeah, trying to find civil war and just arriving at the great plenitude of a Bucky's, somewhere in Tennessee, and just wondering where is the battle? Where is the battle? Going through aisle after aisle of this gigantic gas station. Um, so Kamala Harris is finally getting out there doing some media interviews. We would like to invite her to come on the Compact podcast. We also extend that invitation to Donald Trump. But Kamala, come on, come on. Uh, she has so far hit CBS's 60 Minutes, and one of the most notable elements of the interview, though, funny enough, a moment that CBS didn't see fit to air on its live broadcast. When Harris was asked what country she sees as our greatest adversary, she said Iran is, quote, the obvious one. She went on to say Iran has American blood on their hands, though she declined to say what kind of military action she would take overseas. It's an interesting moment. It's a hawkish moment for Harris. It's just maybe a bit of a break from the stance of the Obama Biden kind of administration, which sought a rapprochement with Iran. I'm now saying Iran. I said Iran earlier, but Sarab has been helping me to not say that. So I'm going to say Iran going forward here. What'd you make of it, Jeff?
Yeah, it is striking. I mean, I tend to fear that uh, a leader like Harris will be very likely, perhaps like Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, will be very likely to take a hawkish line. I think there's a history of women leaders doing this in various ways in order to kind of overcompensate for the impression that they will be soft and accommodating. And so I do find it slightly worrisome. I my own, I do have significant concern about direct war with Iran. I think it would be a catastrophe, and I honestly, both parties are worrying me in this area. We've heard Trump say that basically Israel should just go straight for Iran's nuclear facilities recently. Um, so one wonders to what extent Harris is as she's done before, she's you know, I mean, directly lifted proposals from Trump. So clearly she's kind of conscious of not wanting to seem weak or soft, or, just not wanting to be outgunned by him in various ways. So one wonders if, she partly is saying this because she is trying to not come across as the soft, weak figure who's going to let the Middle East go up in flames in a way that will harm American interests. And so, yeah, I think it's a bit enigmatic. It's a bit hard to say what it does seem. There was sort of, as I understand it, this very convoluted attempt to kind of construct a new order in the Middle East. A kind of balance of powers situation. We've discussed this before. Lebanon was kind of a linchpin of this project. And it seems that Israel's kind of incursion into Lebanon is, which is underway right now, is in some ways, perhaps sounding the death knell for this particular vision. And that may mean that things are a bit more open ended in terms of how a future Harris administration is going to uh, act in that region, should she get the chance. And I think one doesn't want to make too much of it. In fact, because of the foreign policy apparatus that she will inherit, it's pretty. It's probably most likely there will be some degree of continuity with this approach that's been kind of, give Israel a somewhat free hand, but not too free. Try to keep things more or less balanced out. Don't sort of squeeze Iran too badly. Allow them to maintain a certain presence so as to kind of build this balance of powers situation. As far as I understand, that's kind of been the approach. It does seem like Israel's current actions are, again, potentially just blowing that whole approach up, and so there will be kind of potentially a vacuum, and we'll have to see what comes of it. And I think the other thing is that Israel has shown Iran to be weaker than it was assumed to be, and has also actively weakened its most powerful proxy, which deeply weakened its most powerful proxy, which is Hezbollah. And so, yeah, it's hard to say, but I guess the question I would take out of this is, whatever the Obama-Biden vision for the Middle East has been, which is this kind of balance of powers situation, seems to be teetering on the brink of just falling apart. And that means that there will be, should Harris win, a more open-ended question of what policy in the region will look like going forward. Again, I suspect the Trump approach will be something like allow Israel to pursue a pretty aggressive tack against Iran, but at the same time, try to use whatever pressure is available to make sure it doesn't go on too long, and prevent there from being an actual hot war, involving U.S. troops and Iran. With Harris, I think it's kind of more of an open question what that policy is going to look like going forward.
It's an opportunity, I think, for the realism and restraint faction of the Trump coalition, represented by figures like Will Ruger, a friend of Compact, and head of the American Institute for Economic Research, a libertarian think tank. Yes, we have libertarian friends. We have many libertarian friends at Compact. Um, it's a chance for him and for people gathered around the American conservative, for which I'm a columnist, to press a case for Trump to draw a distinction between himself and the Democrats on this issue. That's not an easy task because there are very, very strongly hawkish elements within the Trump coalition that is as true now as ever. But it's a bit of an opening, and I think uh, that should be done. I do think Trump's basic offer to the American voters has always been something like, I'm tough and I'm going to hit our enemies hard, and there will be no waffling about the fact that there are enemies, but I will get us out of and keep us out of the forever wars. Walking that line isn't easy. You know, can sort of Jacksonianism really uh, disentangle itself fully from a more ambitious effort at regime change and whatnot? Those are deep questions we can't really settle here. But I think Trump's uh, basic offer to the American electorate is, on its face, an appealing one, and he should try to distinguish himself, and people around him should urge him to distinguish himself from uh, a progressivism that is somewhat more ambitious. A progressivism present on both sides of the political aisle is somewhat more ambitious in its foreign policy. One question I also had coming out of that Harris comment is just, what about China, as Trump calls it? Uh, will there be a pivot away from the bipartisan consensus that China is an adversary? Um, maybe slightly. I suspect though that the kind of reconfiguration of relations between America and China is baked into the cake and just a matter of broader trends both parties are going to have to respond to. So I don't know. I do think that's a big question. What what about the Pacific?
Yeah, agreed, and I think that ties into questions about to what extent Harris will persist in the kind of the Biden Trump consensus around tariffs, around industrial policy, around attempting to reshore supply chains, particularly for things like chips. And so, yeah, and she's given, and her campaign have given mixed signals on this front as well. And this is obviously just extremely crucial as far as what foreign policy, but also political economy and our sort of orientation going forward. There are certainly some signals from the Harris camp that there could be a kind of reversion or an attempt to revert to status quo ante kind of. I suppose some sort of attempt to resuscitate Chimerica. I'm not sure, and again, I think that the signals have been very mixed and unclear, but there's certainly some possibility of that, which I think would go. And again, I think this speaks partly to the relatively substanceless quality of the campaign. It's kind of just like, trust me you know. Uh, to offer something new to get us beyond this divisiveness, and then we'll and to kind of lay Donald Trump to rest as a political force, and then we'll figure it out once we're in office. I mean, there is really this quality to the campaign, which is disturbing given the seriousness of a lot of these issues that on both Middle East and East Asia policy, which have profound implications. It really, I don't get a clear signal as to what direction she would take us in, which concerns me quite a bit.
Make Chimerica great again. You heard it here first. Um, so the CBS interview, real, but we've seen the rise of deep fakes, the manipulated video voices. Both red states and blue states have made certain legislative moves against these things. There are real worries about how they'll affect our political process. There's been a previous round of controversy about their use in revenge porn. Can someone's face be just inserted into a pornographic video that's then published online? Is that really acceptable? And now it's moved into the political sphere, where I think a whole different set of questions is engaged. uh, yeah, I'll just say something first before I kick it over to you, Jeff. I think that kind of falsely using the image of a private citizen is more, in something like revenge porn, is a lot more worrisome to me than uh, falsely using the image of an elected politician. And I see kind of two distinctions here. One is that in the case of a kind of deep fake that's involved in some kind of political ad or so-called political satire or whatever, and undoubtedly in many cases this would be done with the actual intent to deceive and to convince people that the politician had said something he didn't. Um, I do think that there can be a broader allowance there for a couple of reasons. One, the politician is a public figure, and two, we're talking about political contestation and political speech, where you want to allow just rougher play and broader freedom uh, for the sake of preserving our political culture. Which is protected by the First Amendment. Of course, we have libel laws, which it seems would come into play here. So if you make a kind of false and malicious claim about someone, maybe the libel law could come into force. But I guess I'm very leery of any kind of attempt beyond our existing libel system to limit deepfakes in the political sphere. Uh, and if I can just draw such a neat distinction, though, I would say I'm much more open to uh, attempts to stamp out their employment against really private citizens or some undergraduate who's someone's ex-girlfriend or boyfriend, a pornographic video or a fake recording of some guy saying the n-word when he never said that or something, right? Anyway, clear up my confusion. Can we draw any of these distinctions, or uh, how are we supposed to respond to this?
Yeah, I think that seems right to me. I would agree with that take on it. The piece that we published in Compact is by Jacques Berliner-Blau, and it's about the controversy around a law passed in California, which has now been suspended due to a court injunction, and the law bans political deepfakes. It bans specifically political ads making use of deepfakes, and it sort of has a few sort of exception. It has an exception carved out for satire, which is sort of an interesting. Um, it raises a bunch of interesting questions. But yeah, I mean, my overall take on it is that
Right. So would
yeah,
Saturday Night Live be
yeah, right, right, right. Well, that's
a
yeah,
deep fake if you have Alec Baldwin wearing a kind of orange toupee?
right. Well, yeah, I was wondering this as well. That so there is sort of yeah. I mean, I think clearly with kind of satire and various things like that, which have involved impersonation. This isn't completely unexplored territory. The thing that prompted this legislation was like a fake video of Kamala Harris, I think saying she was like the ultimate DEI hire or something like that. so so basically, yeah, it was sort of a Clearly a kind of Democratic Party protecting its own move. I mean, this is, she's a California Democrat, the Gavin Newsom, close political ally and longtime associate. Basically with the aid of the California Democratic Party, kind of pushed through this law. So it seems pretty dubious. I mean, I think the First Amendment, sort of considerations around it, and the questions it'll raise, it will be an interesting, because it is kind of a new frontier. It'll be an interesting set of court cases, I imagine. But I would tend to agree with you about the distinction between private citizens and just the point that defamation, libel law does offer an avenue of restraining this kind of material, at least in theory, but would be more limited in its ability to restrain it when when directed at public figures and political figures. The further point I would make, just that I think is interesting about all this, is it's what I think is interesting is less the point that people are going. I don't think people are going to be deceived that long by any deep fake, right? I think the concern isn't so much that people will think these are real in any significant way. It's actually more the opposite, that we once this technology starts operating at scale, we will simply have another kind of broad epistemological crisis where, in fact, the default assumption will be that everything is fake, right? it it actually won't be so much the concern that fake things are real, but that real things are fake, and that basically everything will be subject to distrust. The function of video and photography as some kind of attestation to reality, with a sort of indexical relation to reference in the world, is completely disrupted by these developments. And so then the question becomes, this particular form of evidence, which is fundamental to how the media operates, to how we tend to apprehend reality on a large scale, is disrupted, and the result is a sort of a new, very postmodern epistemological crisis where uh, the sort of baseline of what is true and what is false is altered. And I think there are concerns that less have to do with the impact of any particular video than with the broader impact that this will have on our sort of collective apprehension of reality. And it certainly is going to bring about changes in that area, and is already doing so. But I don't know. I don't know how law responds to that. I think fundamentally the question is going to be, kind of what the cultural response to it is, and how the media responds to it. So yeah, I think it is an interesting case. I would imagine the this particular law will be struck down, and rightly so. But that isn't to say the technology doesn't raise quite significant concerns.
I think that's so well observed and certainly true. I'll just add one more of minor point. When I hear about efforts to legally restrict deepfakes, I can't help but think of the widespread claims earlier this year that Republican operatives and conservative social media users were engaged in the dissemination of cheap fakes regarding Biden's, purported weakness and mental incapacity, claims that later received some vindication when the entire Democratic apparatus reacted with horror to his debate performance and forced him off the presidential ticket. So, if deepfakes are to be regulated, then are cheapfakes to be regulated? And perhaps I'm a little too close to some of those libertarian friends I mentioned earlier, but I start to get a little uncomfortable when I kind of hear about these attempts to limit, misinformation and disinformation, because certainly the propagation of false claims has always been a part of our vibrant free speech culture. But the kind of devaluation of video, of the image, of the recording, all this seems to be in the cards. So I really don't know what'll follow that. Anyway, with that, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, listeners. Thanks as well to Stephen Adebato, our colleague who produces this podcast. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.